The journey to the atomic bomb did not begin in the fortified secrecy of a desert laboratory, but in the quiet, theoretical corners of early 20th century physics, driven by an elegant, yet terrifying equation penned by a young Albert Einstein in 1905. E equals mc squared. This formula, seemingly abstract and disconnected from the political turmoil of the world, defined the fundamental relationship between mass, symbolized by the letter m, and energy, symbolized by the letter E. The equation stated that mass and energy are completely interchangeable, and that a tiny amount of mass could be converted into a monstrous amount of energy when multiplied by c squared, with c being the speed of light, an astronomical number. Einstein's work laid the philosophical groundwork, demonstrating that the potential for harnessing cataclysmic power was embedded within the very structure of matter. Yet, for decades, this power remained locked within the atom, a theoretical possibility with no practical key. The true unlocking occurred in the late 1930s, catalyzed by the meticulous experimental work of scientists across Europe. Key among them were German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, who in December 1938 published their baffling discovery. When they bombarded uranium with neutrons, they did not produce heavier elements as expected, but instead found lighter elements like barium. They had, unknowingly, achieved nuclear fission. The physical explanation of this baffling result was immediately provided by the Austrian-Swedish physicist Lise Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch. Meitner, a brilliant Jewish scientist who had been forced to flee Nazi Germany, realized that the uranium nucleus was not merely chipped by the neutron. It was split entirely, dividing into two smaller parts and, critically, releasing a massive burst of energy and additional neutrons in the process. Frisch, borrowing a biological term, named the process fission. The implication of this discovery sent a tremor through the global scientific community. The release of energy was enormous, exponentially greater than any chemical reaction known, validating Einstein's theoretical prediction. But the realization that the splitting nucleus also released more neutrons was the game changer. This suggested the possibility of a nuclear chain reaction, a self-sustaining process where the neutrons released from one fission event could strike and split other uranium nuclei, releasing yet more neutrons and yet more energy in a geometric progression. If a critical mass of uranium could be assembled and the chain reaction successfully initiated, the resultant energy release would be not merely an explosion, but a world-altering cataclysm, a bomb unlike any ever conceived. The seemingly innocuous laboratory result of Hahn and Strassmann, quickly interpreted by Meitner and Frisch, transformed the esoteric field of nuclear physics into the most urgent and terrifying military priority of the impending World War. The invisible power was now conceptually visible, and the race was on to build a weapon based on the fundamental laws of the universe. The realization that this capability now existed, and that the original discovery had been made in Nazi Germany, was the final, terrifying catalyst that spurred the world into action. The theoretical anxieties were now concrete, demanding immediate attention from political leaders who, until that point, had barely understood the difference between an atom and a molecule. The physicists knew, however, that the discovery meant the world had entered a new, perilous era. The realization that nuclear fission had been achieved in late 1938 immediately coupled the scientific possibility of the atomic bomb with a terrifying geopolitical reality. The discovery had originated in Nazi Germany. This fact, more than any other, provided the initial desperate urgency that would launch the American effort. The Nazi regime, with its formidable scientific and industrial base, was now widely perceived as possessing the intellectual head start in the race to weaponize the atom. For the European scientific community, particularly the brilliant Jewish and politically liberal physicists, the rise of Hitler had already initiated a devastating brain drain that profoundly affected the global distribution of nuclear expertise. Scientists such as Lise Meitner, Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi, Edward Teller, and Eugene Wigner, all giants in their field and many of them Jewish, had been forced to flee Hitler's Europe, seeking refuge primarily in Britain and the United States. This mass exodus inadvertently provided the Allies with the critical mass of intellectual firepower necessary for the Manhattan Project. These émigré scientists were not merely brilliant. They carried with them an acute existential fear of the German bomb. They understood, better than any Allied politician or general, both the scientific feasibility of the weapon and the sheer, unbridled ruthlessness with which the Nazi regime would use such a weapon to enforce its totalitarian vision. They were not driven by simple patriotism, but by a chilling moral imperative. Their former colleagues still in Germany, such as Werner Heisenberg, were known to be leading the German Uranium Club, in German, the Uranverein, a secretive research program investigating nuclear energy. To the émigrés, the possibility that the Nazis could produce a superweapon first was an apocalyptic scenario that necessitated immediate, preemptive action, even if it meant helping to create a weapon of terrifying destructive power. This existential anxiety transcended traditional military concerns. It was a race to secure the future of liberal democracy and potentially the entire human race. As the Blitzkrieg swept across Europe and the German military machine proved virtually unstoppable, the shadow of the Nazi bomb grew longer. Reports, often fragmentary and exaggerated, filtered through intelligence channels, suggesting that the German program was advancing rapidly toward the production of a fission device. While later historical analysis would show the German program was hampered by internal divisions, resource limitations, and Heisenberg's own miscalculations on the necessary critical mass, the fear in 1939 and 1940 was absolute and unassailable. The scientists who had fled were the very ones who knew the secrets of the atom, and they could not shake the horror that their former nation might deploy that knowledge against the free world. Their voices, though initially whispers in the halls of power, grew louder with every German victory, demanding that the United States recognize the severity of the threat and mobilize its vast industrial resources. This perception of an imminent existential threat from the German scientific military complex was the primary psychological engine that drove the early tentative steps of the American and British nuclear efforts, providing the moral and political justification for committing vast, unprecedented resources to a project that was, at its core, a defensive race against an unseen ultimate enemy. The specter of a swastika-adorned mushroom cloud provided the final, undeniable proof that this war would be fought not just with bullets and tanks, but with the very building blocks of the universe. The scientific realization of fission and the profound fear of a German atomic weapon remained confined to the intellectual circles of émigré physicists until a coordinated effort was made to breach the walls of political indifference and alert the highest levels of the United States government. The pivotal moment that transformed theoretical fear into military action was the drafting and delivery of the Einstein-Szilard letter in the summer of 1939. The initiative was spearheaded by the Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard, a visionary and deeply concerned scientist who had been instrumental in recognizing the possibility of the nuclear chain reaction. Szilard, recognizing that his own political standing was too low to command the attention of the White House, understood that he needed a figure of unparalleled moral and intellectual authority to convey the urgency of the situation. He turned to his friend and colleague, Albert Einstein, who, though primarily a theoretical physicist removed from the operational details of fission, was the world's most famous scientist and a powerful symbol of émigré anti-Nazism. The letter, primarily drafted by Szilard and fellow Hungarian physicist Eugene Wigner, but signed by Einstein on August 2, 1939, was a model of concise urgency. It informed President Franklin D. Roosevelt of the recent work of Fermi and Szilard on the possibility of a nuclear chain reaction using uranium, noting that this could lead to the construction of extremely powerful bombs of a new type. Crucially, the letter pointedly warned that Germany has actually stopped the sale of uranium from the Czechoslovakian mines which she has taken over, providing tangible evidence that the Nazis were taking the threat seriously. The warning was clear: if the United States did not act, Germany would inevitably gain the ultimate weapon. Despite Einstein's name, the letter did not immediately spur dramatic action. It was delivered to President Roosevelt in October 1939, 2 months after it was signed and just after the outbreak of World War II in Europe, by economist Alexander Sachs, a personal friend of the president. Sachs eloquently stressed the transformative nature of the potential weapon, famously comparing the discovery to the moment the Chinese dismissed the use of gunpowder for military purposes, allowing Europeans to harness it for cannon. Roosevelt was finally convinced. His response, after a moment of contemplation, was reportedly, "This requires action." The president then authorized the formation of the Advisory Committee on Uranium, later known as the S1 Committee, placing it under the head of the National Bureau of Standards. This authorization, though initially leading to only meager funding of $6,000 for research into uranium and graphite, was the essential bureaucratic first step. It marked the official moment the United States government acknowledged the military potential of atomic energy and committed to investigating its feasibility. The letter served as the single most critical bridge between the theoretical anxieties of the scientific community and the immense, practical power of the American state, transforming a frightening scientific conjecture into a matter of paramount national security. It was the first secret directive that set the entire colossal machinery of the Manhattan Project into motion, a chain reaction of political will mirroring the scientific one the physicists sought to master. The presidential approval to investigate the atomic threat, initiated by the Einstein-Szilard letter, led to the formation of the Advisory Committee on Uranium, marking the quiet, bureaucratic inception of what would later become the Manhattan Project. However, these early years, spanning from late 1939 to late 1941, were characterized more by scientific skepticism, bureaucratic inertia, and a palpable lack of urgency rather than the all-out mobilization that would follow. The initial committee, a small group of scientists and military liaisons, struggled with the immense scientific uncertainties that still plagued the feasibility of an atomic bomb. Scientists were grappling with fundamental questions. Could a chain reaction be reliably sustained? Which isotope of uranium, the rare uranium-235, or the more common uranium-238, was the key? Could the necessary quantity of material, the critical mass, be practically produced? The funding was negligible, and the research, scattered across universities like Columbia, Princeton, and Berkeley, proceeded slowly. American military and political leaders, initially distracted by the pressing demands of conventional warfare and wary of investing vast sums in a weapon with an infinitesimal chance of success, gave the project only tepid support. The general mood was one of academic curiosity tempered by wartime caution, a far cry from the life-or-death urgency felt by the émigré scientists. This complacency was shattered in late 1941 by two crucial developments. First, the report of the British Maud Committee reached American shores. The British scientists, particularly after the pioneering work of Otto Frisch and Rudolf P. Ailes, had determined with startling clarity that a uranium bomb was not only theoretically possible but could be built with far less fissile material than previously estimated, potentially within a few years. This intelligence transformed the bomb from a distant scientific dream into a near-term engineering possibility. The realization that the bomb could be smaller and built faster was a shock to the American establishment. Second, the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 violently catapulted the United States into World War II, immediately stripping away the last vestiges of bureaucratic hesitancy. The war was no longer an overseas conflict. It was an existential struggle demanding every possible technological edge. In the face of these events, the scientific advisory efforts were consolidated and placed under the newly created Office of Scientific Research and Development, or OSRD, headed by Vannevar Bush. The project was officially renamed the S1 section, and a full-scale feasibility study was initiated. Crucially, the decision was made to shift the project from purely scientific research to a massive engineering and industrial undertaking. Recognizing that a project of this scale, cost, and secrecy required the immense organizational power and resources of the military, the final transition occurred in the summer of 1942, when the S1 committee was transferred to the command of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This move marked the end of the quiet beginning and the birth of the Manhattan Engineer District, officially inaugurating the massive hyper-secret enterprise known to history as the Manhattan Project. The quiet, theoretical anxieties of the physicists were now backed by the virtually limitless resources of a nation at total war, and the race had officially begun. The transformation of the nuclear project from an academic pursuit into a massive industrial undertaking required a manager with a unique and powerful blend of organizational acumen, ruthless efficiency, and an almost fanatical dedication to secrecy. That man was Brigadier General Leslie Groves, a stout, formidable engineer from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who was appointed the director of the Manhattan Project in September 1942. Groves was an unlikely choice in the eyes of the academic community. He was a career military officer, a brilliant civil engineer, and an individual known for his impatience, his intolerance for bureaucratic inefficiency, and his absolute demand for competence. Prior to his appointment, he had overseen the construction of the Pentagon, a project of immense complexity, which demonstrated his ability to manage massive construction efforts under severe time constraints. When he took over the atomic project, he had never even met a theoretical physicist, a fact that both amused and intimidated the brilliant, eccentric scientists he was suddenly commanding. Groves immediately brought a decisive military structure to the fragmented scientific effort. His contribution was not scientific, but organizational and logistical. He viewed the bomb not as an experiment, but as a vast, complex engineering and production challenge that required the creation of an industrial pipeline on an unprecedented scale. He moved with lightning speed, acquiring vast, secluded tracts of land for the project's secret sites: Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington, and Los Alamos in New Mexico, displacing thousands of citizens and establishing entire cities overnight, all while maintaining absolute secrecy. His commitment to security was total and uncompromising. The project was compartmentalized into thousands of isolated sections, ensuring that no single individual, often not even the scientists themselves, knew the full scope of the project or the ultimate purpose of their work. A chemist working on isotope separation at Oak Ridge had no idea his processed uranium was destined for a bomb being designed in the New Mexico desert. This intense compartmentalization, enforced by Groves with a heavy hand, was essential to preventing enemy espionage and ensuring the project's success. He demanded that all research, development, and production be conducted with a need-to-know philosophy, a bureaucratic nightmare that was nonetheless highly effective at preventing leaks. Groves's leadership style was often authoritarian and confrontational. He frequently clashed with the theoretical physicists, whom he viewed as impractical and overly concerned with moral niceties. Yet, he recognized the unique genius of figures like J. Robert Oppenheimer and ultimately empowered them, providing them with virtually limitless funding and resources to achieve their scientific objectives. Groves understood that the success of the Manhattan Project was less about a single scientific breakthrough and more about the synchronized, industrialized production of fissile material. He was the indispensable military mind who transformed a terrifying equation into the ultimate weapon, proving that in the race for the bomb, organization and engineering were just as critical as the physics itself. Without his singular focus and uncompromising dedication to his deadline, the atomic bomb would likely not have been ready in time to influence the end of World War II. If General Leslie Groves provided the military structure and logistical force for the Manhattan Project, then J. Robert Oppenheimer provided the indispensable scientific genius and intellectual leadership. The theoretical physicist, known for his piercing blue eyes, intense intellectual curiosity, and complex, charismatic personality, was appointed the director of the project's secret weapons laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, in 1943. Oppenheimer's initial appointment was controversial. He was a theoretical physicist with no proven experience managing a large laboratory or engineering project. Furthermore, he had a documented history of political associations with left-leaning and communist-affiliated groups, raising serious security concerns among military intelligence. However, Groves, after meeting Oppenheimer, recognized a unique confluence of intellectual and personal qualities that made him the only choice. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of all aspects of nuclear physics necessary for the bomb's design, and he possessed an extraordinary ability to quickly grasp and synthesize complex scientific problems across multiple disciplines. Most importantly, Oppenheimer had the charisma and intellectual depth necessary to command the respect and cooperation of the diverse, brilliant, and often eccentric scientists from around the world who were assembled at the remote Los Alamos site. He was fluent in multiple languages and equally fluent in the language of every scientific subdiscipline, making him the perfect communicator. Under his guidance, Los Alamos became the intellectual hub of the entire project, with the various streams of scientific effort: the uranium production from Oak Ridge and the plutonium from Hanford, converged for the final, critical phase of weapon design. Oppenheimer's greatest contribution was his openness and collaborative leadership style. Unlike the military's strict compartmentalization enforced at the production sites, Oppenheimer insisted on full communication among the scientists at Los Alamos regarding the fundamental physics of the bomb design. He argued, correctly, that the scientific problems were too intertwined and complex to be solved in isolation. This collaborative environment fostered a unique scientific energy, accelerating the pace of discovery and problem-solving, particularly in overcoming the complex challenges of the plutonium implosion design, which required an unprecedented understanding of high explosives and hydrodynamics. Oppenheimer was the ultimate synthesizer, capable of translating complex engineering requirements into fundamental physics problems, and vice versa. He created a university-like atmosphere where, despite the intense pressure and secrecy, scientific discussion flourished. His own personal journey mirrored the moral complexities of the project. He was a deeply reflective man, often quoting poetry and philosophy, who fully understood the profound, destructive implications of the weapon he was designing. His role was not merely technical, it was also psychological. He held together an assembly of some of the world's most brilliant minds, steering their genius toward the single terrifying objective of the atomic bomb, all while carrying the immense moral weight of the project on his own shoulders. Oppenheimer was the scientific heart and soul of the Manhattan Project, the visionary who led the theoretical journey from E=mc² to the final weapon, a process that would irrevocably mark him with both the glory of scientific triumph and the profound burden of human destruction, making him the central tragic figure in the story of the atomic age. The sheer audacity and unprecedented scale of the nuclear program necessitated a military cover that was as unremarkable as possible yet broad enough to encompass its continent-spanning scope. The project was formally designated the Manhattan Engineer District, or MED, in August 1942, a bureaucratic title selected because the initial, small-scale work was administratively managed from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers office in New York City. The code name Manhattan Project stuck, a deliberately mundane and geographically misleading label that successfully masked the true nature and vast geographical scale of the secret enterprise. The first major task for General Groves was the selection and establishment of the primary sites. 3 immense, secret cities built virtually overnight in remote, secluded areas to ensure both security and sufficient space for the massive, industrial facilities required to produce the fissile materials. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was chosen for the colossal task of uranium enrichment. The vast Tennessee Valley area provided abundant power from the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, hydroelectric dams, and the necessary isolation. Here, the uranium-235 isotope, which makes up less than 1% of natural uranium, would be painstakingly separated from the uranium-238, a process requiring industrial-scale application of multiple, complex technologies. The need for constant, massive amounts of electricity made this remote location essential. Hanford, Washington, was selected for the production of plutonium. Located on the vast, desolate plains of the Columbia River, the site was ideal because it offered a massive water supply for cooling the nuclear reactors needed to transmute uranium-238 into plutonium, a new, man-made element that had never been produced in industrial quantities. The danger of operating these early reactors demanded extreme isolation, which the desert landscape provided. Los Alamos, New Mexico, was chosen by Oppenheimer himself. A secluded mesa high in the Jemez Mountains, it provided the necessary isolation for the final, secret design and assembly of the actual bomb, far from prying eyes and potential espionage, establishing a secure home for the project's brightest minds. The securing of funding was arguably the greatest single administrative hurdle, yet it was executed with extraordinary secrecy and speed, demonstrating the supreme commitment of President Roosevelt. The project's total cost would eventually surpass $2 billion, the equivalent of over $30 billion today, an astronomical figure for the time that exceeded the combined cost of the Panama Canal and the Hoover Dam. To prevent Congress and the press from detecting the project, Groves and Bush established a system where the massive funds were dispersed through military channels and various defense appropriations, often buried deep within the budgets of other, seemingly unrelated defense projects. This financial sleight of hand was a crucial element of the project's security, ensuring that the necessary industrial mobilization could proceed at maximum speed without public or congressional oversight. The creation of these 3 massive, interconnected, yet geographically distant centers, all operating under the veil of a simple New York code name, demonstrated the unique blend of scientific ingenuity, ruthless military efficiency, and total secrecy that defined the Manhattan Project. The scale of the money committed was a silent testament to the terrifying potential of the weapon they were rushing to complete. From its inception, the Manhattan Project was defined by two parallel, intertwined struggles: the scientific race against time to master nuclear physics, and the terrifying, silent intelligence war waged by the Soviet Union to steal the secrets of the atomic bomb. The Allies had been driven to create the weapon by the fear of a Nazi bomb, but by 1944, as the German threat receded, the focus of the security efforts shifted decisively toward the growing ideological and military rival, the Soviet Union. The Soviets, led by Joseph Stalin and his intelligence chief Lavrentiy Beria, were acutely aware of the potential of the atomic bomb and had initiated their own parallel research program. They understood that the side which possessed this ultimate weapon would hold an unassailable advantage in the post-war world order. Therefore, the Soviet intelligence apparatus, primarily the NKVD and the GRU, launched an extensive, highly successful espionage campaign to infiltrate the Manhattan Project. The vulnerability of the project lay in its immense size and its reliance on a diverse scientific community. The Soviet strategy was not to infiltrate the high-security military administration, but to exploit the ideological sympathies and moral anxieties of some of the scientists and technicians. They successfully recruited several key figures, known collectively as the atomic spies, who were motivated not by financial gain, but often by a misguided belief that sharing the secret with the Soviet Union, the wartime ally and ideological counterweight to Western capitalism, would prevent a dangerous post-war American nuclear monopoly and ensure a balance of power, thereby promoting global peace. The most damaging of these spies were physicist Klaus Fuchs and technician David Greenglass. Fuchs, a German-born physicist and a dedicated communist, worked at the theoretical division at Los Alamos and had access to virtually all the critical design secrets, including the dimensions of the implosion device and the full results of the Trinity test. Greenglass, an American Army technician, provided detailed schematics of the internal components of the bombs. The intelligence provided by these spies was invaluable. It significantly accelerated the Soviet Union's own atomic bomb program, allowing them to bypass years of developmental dead ends and directly utilize the successful American designs. When the Soviets tested their first atomic device in August 1949, far earlier than American intelligence had anticipated, it was a direct testament to the success of their espionage efforts within the Manhattan Project. General Groves and the military intelligence apparatus were aware of the espionage threat and implemented massive security measures. Yet the sheer scope of the project and the deep-seated ideological motivations of the spies proved impossible to contain entirely. The success of Soviet espionage within the Manhattan Project was a historical irony. The very secrecy designed to protect the weapon from the Axis powers ultimately failed to protect it from the soon-to-be Cold War adversary, ensuring that the dawning of the atomic age would immediately begin with the terrifying reality of a bilateral arms race. The silence and compartmentalization imposed by Groves, while defeating the enemy on one front, inadvertently created the perfect conditions for a different, unseen enemy to succeed on another. The most daunting technical challenge of the entire Manhattan Project was not the theoretical physics of fission, but the vast, unprecedented industrial challenge of producing the fissile material, specifically, separating the rare uranium-235 isotope from the far more abundant uranium-238. This task was so monumental that General Groves committed to pursuing 3 separate, highly complex technological processes simultaneously at the massive, secret facility of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in a costly race against time and technological uncertainty. Natural uranium consists of only 0.7% of the fissionable uranium-235. The remaining 99.3% is the non-fissionable uranium-238. The task was to enrich this percentage to over 90% to achieve the required weapons-grade material. The first process was gaseous diffusion, housed in the gargantuan K-25 plant. This method exploited the tiny mass difference between the two isotopes. Uranium hexafluoride gas would be repeatedly pushed through thousands of fine porous barriers. The lighter uranium-235 atoms would pass through slightly faster than the heavier uranium-238 atoms, gradually increasing the concentration of the fissile isotope. The sheer scale of the K-25 plant, covering over 40 acres under one roof and utilizing thousands of kilometers of piping, made it the largest building in the world at the time, consuming enormous quantities of electricity. The second primary process was the use of calatrons, housed in the Y-12 plant. Developed by Ernest O. Lawrence at Berkeley, the calatrons, named for the California University cyclotron, were massive electromagnetic separators. They worked by vaporizing uranium and passing the ions through an enormous magnetic field, which deflected the lighter uranium-235 ions into a slightly different, separate path from the heavier uranium-238 ions, allowing them to be collected. The magnets for these calatrons were so large that the project required the use of thousands of tons of silver borrowed from the U.S. Treasury, as copper, the usual material, was scarce due to the war effort, to wind the electromagnets, another testament to the extreme resource commitment of the project. A third method, thermal diffusion, was also tested. The commitment to these three parallel competitive technologies, gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation using calatrons, and thermal diffusion, reflected Groves's strategic imperative to ensure that at least one method succeeded in producing the necessary few kilograms of weapons-grade uranium, regardless of the cost or redundancy. The workers at Oak Ridge, many of them women from the surrounding region, operated these massive, complex facilities day and night, often with no comprehension of the ultimate purpose of the vast machinery they were tending. The K-25 and Y-12 plants were not merely factories. They were unprecedented industrial miracles, created in total secrecy, whose successful operation determined the timeline for the final, terrifying delivery of the first atomic weapon. The uranium produced here was destined for the little boy bomb, the first type to be used in conflict. While Oak Ridge pursued the complex separation of uranium-235, the Manhattan Project pursued an equally monumental and entirely novel path toward an alternative fissile material at the sprawling remote site of Hanford, Washington, the large-scale production of plutonium-239. This path was predicated on a theory confirmed by the work of Nobel laureate Enrico Fermi and his team, that the more common uranium-238, though not directly fissionable, could be transmuted into a brand new man-made element, plutonium, inside a nuclear reactor, and that this new element would be highly fissionable. The commitment to the plutonium path offered a significant advantage. If successful, it would bypass the painfully slow and expensive isotope separation process at Oak Ridge. However, it required the invention, construction, and operation of large-scale nuclear reactors, a technology that did not yet exist. The critical first step was achieved in Chicago. On December 2, 1942, under the stands of the University of Chicago Stagg Field, Fermi and his team built Chicago Pile 1, or CP1, the world's first sustained, self-perpetuating nuclear chain reaction using uranium and graphite blocks. CP-1 was an experimental success, confirming the feasibility of the reactor design. The challenge immediately shifted from the laboratory to the industrial scale. Hanford was chosen because the process required an enormous amount of cooling water, which the Columbia River could supply, and the necessary isolation to contain potential catastrophic contamination. Here, General Groves oversaw the rapid construction of massive industrial-scale plutonium production reactors, designated B, D, and F, designed to transmute tons of natural uranium fuel rods. The process was chemically complex and highly hazardous. Uranium slugs were inserted into the reactor piles, where the controlled chain reaction would convert some of the uranium-238 into plutonium-239. Once the transmutation was complete, the irradiated fuel slugs were removed and processed at immense, heavily shielded chemical separation plants, known as canyons due to their size, to chemically extract the tiny amounts of plutonium from the highly radioactive uranium and fission products. The operation was fraught with risk, culminating in a near catastrophe in 1944 when the B reactor experienced a xenon poisoning shutdown, a problem the scientists had to quickly diagnose and solve under intense pressure. The successful operation of the Hanford reactors was an extraordinary technological feat. It meant that the Manhattan Project had created a viable second path to an atomic weapon, ensuring that even if the uranium enrichment at Oak Ridge failed, they would still have the necessary fissile material. The final product, the purified plutonium, was a dangerous silvery metal, the first man-made element ever produced in industrial quantities. The plutonium path, born from a theoretical concept confirmed beneath a football field, gave the project its second chance and proved that the atomic bomb could be built using two entirely different, yet equally revolutionary materials. The success at Hanford guaranteed that the weapon race was now firmly in the hands of the United States. The plutonium produced here was destined for the Fat Man bomb, the more technologically complex of the two designs. The transformation of nuclear theory into a viable weapon necessitated an engineering and construction effort of a magnitude utterly unprecedented in history, an effort that required the near-limitless financial and material resources of the United States at war. The Manhattan Project was, at its core, a sprawling continental industrial mobilization managed entirely under the impenetrable cloak of military secrecy, giving rise to entire temporary secret cities that did not appear on any public map. The sheer scale of the construction was an engineering marvel. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the site rapidly swelled from a remote farming area into a city of over 75,000 residents, all employees of the project. The gargantuan K-25 plant alone, built to enrich uranium-235 through gaseous diffusion, consumed a significant fraction of all available construction materials in the United States and was the largest single structure under one roof in the world. Its operation required more electricity than the entire city of New York, a consumption rate that necessitated an immense new power infrastructure. The cost, ultimately exceeding $2 billion, made it the most expensive project of the war, a figure kept hidden through careful bookkeeping and dispersal across multiple military appropriations. At Hanford, Washington, the construction was no less monumental, but carried far greater environmental and safety risks. The engineers had to design and build three immense, graphite-moderated nuclear production reactors along the Columbia River, a feat never before attempted. The B reactor, the first full-scale reactor, was a vast concrete and steel shield designed to safely contain the intense radiation of the chain reaction, requiring the rapid deployment of thousands of specialized workers, many of whom were unaware they were building a nuclear facility. The accompanying chemical separation plants, known as the canyons, were massive remote-controlled facilities where the highly radioactive plutonium was extracted, requiring specialized shielding walls several feet thick. The secrecy surrounding these engineering feats was obsessive and total. The military utilized a policy of compartmentalization on an industrial scale. Construction workers at Oak Ridge were tasked with building sections of the K-25 plant without ever seeing the blueprint for the entire structure. They were told they were building a vast facility for the production of naval equipment or a secret synthetic rubber factory. The scientists and technicians who operated the various separation columns and reactors were often unaware of the final product or its military application, knowing only the immediate process in front of them. The workers at Hanford, for instance, knew they were working with a radioactive metal, but not that they were pioneering the industrial creation of a brand new element that would power the world's most destructive weapon. General Groves's singular genius lay in coordinating this vast, disparate industrial landscape. He managed the logistical nightmare of raw material procurement, labor allocation, and technological development across dozens of sites and multiple scientific disciplines, ensuring that the entire pipeline, from the mining of uranium or to the delivery of the final fissile material to Los Alamos, remained on schedule. The Manhattan Project was ultimately an engineering and managerial triumph built on the foundations of physics, demonstrating the unprecedented power of the United States industrial base when mobilized by total war and driven by the terrifying possibility of atomic weaponry. The capstone of the Manhattan Project, the place where all the threads of theoretical science, industrial production, and military necessity finally converged, was Los Alamos, New Mexico. Perched atop the remote, desolate mesas of the Jemez Mountains, the site, initially a small private school, was transformed overnight into a secret city where the world's greatest scientific minds lived, worked, and raced to assemble the final weapon. General Groves and J. Robert Oppenheimer chose Los Alamos, or Site Y, specifically for its isolation. The site was built from scratch, lacking basic amenities and requiring the scientists and their families to live in primitive, often hastily constructed military housing, all while under the constant watchful eye of military security. The scientific community here was extraordinary. A temporary, high-security concentration of Nobel laureates and young, brilliant PhDs who had been abruptly pulled from universities across the globe. Names like Fermi, Teller, Bethe, Feynman, and many others lived and worked side by side, united by the singular terrifying goal of building the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer, as the site director, consciously fostered an open, collaborative intellectual environment, a sharp contrast to the strict compartmentalization enforced at the production sites of Oak Ridge and Hanford. He correctly realized that the final stages of weapon design were so complex, involving unprecedented calculations in hydrodynamics, neutronics, and high explosive detonation, that no single individual could solve them in isolation. Theoretical physicists worked directly alongside metallurgists, chemists, and ordnance engineers, sharing all the data necessary for the final calculations of critical mass and weapon performance. This intense intellectual synergy accelerated the pace of development, transforming Los Alamos into the most fertile, high-pressure research environment in human history. The work at Los Alamos was divided into two parallel, simultaneous efforts: the design of the Little Boy, the uranium-235 gun-type weapon, and the Fat Man, the plutonium-239 implosion weapon. The Little Boy design was considered relatively straightforward, relying on the mechanism of firing one subcritical piece of uranium-235 into another to instantly achieve critical mass. The Fat Man design, however, presented a much more formidable challenge. Plutonium, unlike uranium-235, proved to be highly susceptible to pre-detonation due to the presence of small amounts of plutonium-240, requiring a far more sophisticated method. The scientists were forced to invent the implosion technique, surrounding a subcritical plutonium core with precisely shaped high-explosive lenses that would detonate simultaneously, crushing the plutonium core inward into a supercritical state faster than the pre-detonation could occur. This required an unprecedented mastery of high-explosive synchronization, demanding engineering precision that seemed impossible at the time. The secret city of Los Alamos was not merely a laboratory. It was a high-stakes crucible where the world's brightest minds battled against physics, time, and the looming shadow of the German threat, determined to deliver the ultimate weapon before the war could claim any more lives. The scientists at Los Alamos faced an existential design challenge that required them to pursue two entirely different technological paths simultaneously, based on the two distinct fissile materials being produced at the immense industrial sites of Oak Ridge and Hanford. These two paths led to the creation of the two distinct bombs: the Little Boy, utilizing uranium-235, and the Fat Man, utilizing plutonium-239. The Little Boy design, intended for use with the highly enriched uranium-235 isotope, was conceptually the simpler of the two. It was a gun-type mechanism, essentially a massive, high-speed cannon designed to fire one subcritical piece of uranium-235 into another piece, instantly assembling the necessary critical mass. The challenge here was largely one of internal ballistics and engineering reliability, ensuring that the projectile component struck the target component with sufficient speed and force to complete the reaction before the heat could cause a premature explosion. Because the physics of this design were considered robust and reliable, the scientists were highly confident that the uranium-235 would fission predictably. General Groves and the project leadership made the momentous decision not to test this design prior to its deployment. Every ounce of the precious, hard-won uranium-235 from Oak Ridge was to be conserved for the actual military weapon. The Fat Man design, utilizing plutonium-239 from Hanford, presented a far more formidable, almost insurmountable challenge. Plutonium, as the scientists discovered, contained a small but critical quantity of the isotope plutonium-240, which spontaneously emitted neutrons at a high rate. If the gun-type mechanism used for Little Boy were attempted with plutonium, the spontaneous neutrons would initiate the chain reaction too early, causing the bomb to merely fizzle in a pre-detonation event known as a fizzle, releasing only a fraction of its potential energy. To overcome this, the scientists, led by the implosion group, were forced to invent the implosion mechanism. The implosion design required that the subcritical plutonium core be surrounded by complex, precisely shaped, high-explosive lenses. These lenses had to be detonated simultaneously with microsecond precision, generating a perfectly spherical, inward-moving shockwave that would symmetrically compress the plutonium core to a density far greater than its normal state. This compression would push the plutonium into a supercritical configuration instantly, forcing the chain reaction to occur faster than the spontaneous neutrons could cause a fizzle. This demand for symmetrical compression was an engineering nightmare, requiring hundreds of precision-cast explosive blocks and an intricate network of specialized detonators. The implosion mechanism was so complex and the risk of failure so high that the scientists deemed a test absolutely essential. The success or failure of the plutonium bomb, and thus the viability of the massive Hanford operation, rested entirely on the success of this implosion design, which necessitated a final, terrifying trial in the New Mexico desert. The two distinct paths, dictated by the two materials, provided the Manhattan Project with an element of redundancy, but also created two parallel sets of impossible engineering challenges that had to be solved simultaneously to ensure the delivery of the ultimate weapon. The fate of the entire Manhattan Project, the billions of dollars, the years of relentless effort, and the moral calculus of its entire purpose, came down to a single terrifying moment in the remote New Mexico desert. The Trinity test, the first full-scale detonation of an atomic device, was scheduled for the pre-dawn hours of July 16, 1945, at the Alamogordo Bombing and Gunnery Range. The device itself was the Fat Man plutonium implosion model, the design deemed too complex to trust without a trial. The plutonium core and its surrounding high-explosive lenses were hoisted atop a 100-foot steel tower in the middle of the desolate Jornada del Muerto, Journey of the Dead Man desert. The scientific and military personnel, including Oppenheimer, Fermi, Groves, and the core Los Alamos team, gathered in observation bunkers 10 miles away, their anticipation a mixture of extreme scientific excitement and profound existential dread. They were about to witness something that had never happened in human history. The final countdown was fraught with tension, exacerbated by a sudden, intense thunderstorm that swept through the test range, threatening to halt the detonation due to the risk of an electrical short circuit in the delicate wiring. General Groves and the military staff debated canceling the test, fully aware that a delay could mean the bomb would not be ready for deployment in the Pacific Theater on schedule. Oppenheimer, whose nervous energy was legendary, chain-smoked and paced, knowing that the failure of this single test would render the massive Hanford plutonium production effort largely useless and postpone the end of the war. After a tense delay, the storm miraculously cleared just enough for the countdown to resume. At 5:29 and 45 seconds a.m. local time, the device was detonated. The initial flash of light was blinding, instantly transforming the dark desert night into a brilliant incandescent daylight, a light far brighter than the sun, seen by observers over 200 miles away. The light was followed by a colossal fireball that surged upward, sucking up dust and sand to form a mushroom-shaped cloud that climbed over 40,000 feet into the atmosphere. The intense heat fused the desert sand into a smooth radioactive green glass, later dubbed Trinitite, marking the crater floor. The tremendous deafening roar of the blast arrived moments later, reverberating across the desert. The initial reactions were varied but intense. Fermi, ever the pragmatist, famously conducted a small experiment by dropping pieces of paper as the shockwave passed, using the displacement to calculate the yield of the blast, which he estimated to be around 20,000 tons of TNT, a wildly successful result. Oppenheimer, watching the terrifying spectacle, was said to have recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The Trinity test was the ultimate, undeniable confirmation of the Manhattan Project's success, proving the implosion concept worked perfectly and demonstrating that humanity had, for the first time, mastered the power that could end civilizations. The terrifying power had been unleashed, and the world had changed forever. The successful, terrifying brilliance of the Trinity test did more than just validate the physics and engineering of the Manhattan Project. It triggered an immediate, profound ethical and psychological crisis among the scientists who had devoted years of their lives to its creation. Having seen the destructive power of the atomic bomb firsthand, they were immediately forced to confront the moral implications of their handiwork. Prior to the test, the Manhattan Project had been largely viewed by its participants as an intellectual game, a technical challenge, and, above all, a desperate race against the Nazis. The driving moral imperative was defensive. to prevent Hitler from gaining the bomb first. With Germany defeated in May 1945 and the Trinity test's blinding flash confirming the bomb's cataclysmic reality, the rationale for its continued development and subsequent use instantly evaporated for many of the scientists, replaced by a deep sense of moral responsibility. The immediate scientific reaction was split. A core group, exemplified by General Groves and the military leadership, viewed the test as an absolute success, a tool that guaranteed a swift end to the war in the Pacific, saving countless Allied lives that would be lost in a planned invasion of Japan. However, a significant fraction of the Los Alamos and Chicago-based scientists, led by figures like Leo Szilard and James Frank, mobilized immediately to argue against the combat use of the weapon without prior warning. The Frank report, submitted to the interim committee advising President Truman, articulated this moral shift. It argued passionately that dropping the bomb on a Japanese city without demonstration would be a moral error that would doom the world to a nuclear arms race and permanently tarnish the United States' international standing. The scientists proposed alternatives: a non-lethal demonstration of the bomb's power to Japanese observers in an unpopulated area, or a clear warning detailing the nature of the weapon before use. Their central argument was that using the bomb without warning would forfeit the moral authority needed to manage the impending nuclear age. Oppenheimer, the man who had overseen the bomb's creation, found himself caught between the two camps. While he harbored deep moral reservations, later speaking eloquently about the blood on our hands, he ultimately sided with the military and political establishment, believing that no demonstration would be politically effective enough to force Japan's surrender. His own intense desire to see the project's scientific success translated into military value, coupled with his position as the ultimate insider, led him to accept the decision to use the bomb. The aftermath of Trinity was thus a moment of profound confrontation. The brilliant success of science meeting the grim reality of military application. It marked the beginning of the scientists' post-war moral awakening, where many of the key figures in the Manhattan Project transformed themselves from weapons developers into the first, most passionate advocates for international arms control and the peaceful utilization of atomic energy, forever haunted by the blinding light they had unleashed. Following the successful Trinity test and the final production of the Little Boy and Fat Man devices, the decision regarding their military use shifted entirely from the scientific laboratories to the highest echelons of the U.S. government, becoming the subject of one of the most intense and consequential debates in history. The weight of this decision fell squarely upon the shoulders of the new president, Harry S. Truman, who had only assumed the office upon the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt in April 1945. The primary argument in favor of using the atomic bomb was intensely military and pragmatic: to end the war as swiftly as possible and save Allied lives. Military planners estimated that a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands, code-named Operation Downfall, would result in catastrophic casualties, potentially costing hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese casualties, both military and civilian, in a prolonged, brutal land campaign. The atomic bomb, it was argued, provided a shock weapon powerful enough to force an immediate, unconditional Japanese surrender, thus obviating the need for the bloody invasion. This was the argument that held the most sway with military leaders and with Truman, who had seen the horrifying attrition rates of island-hopping campaigns like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. However, the moral and ethical opposition was robust, largely led by the scientists, as detailed in Chapter 16, and some high-level political figures. Their arguments centered on the moral character of the weapon and the post-war consequences. They argued that the weapon was uniquely inhumane, targeting civilians indiscriminately, and that its use would violate fundamental moral principles, permanently branding the United States as a uniquely ruthless nation. Furthermore, they warned that dropping the bomb without prior warning would instantly trigger a devastating nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union, leading to a precarious balance of terror in the post-war world. They favored a non-combat demonstration or a firm, clear final warning coupled with the assurance of maintaining the Japanese emperor's political position. President Truman was advised by the Interim Committee, a high-level body of politicians, scientists, and military figures. After careful consideration of the alternatives, including the possibility of a non-combat demonstration, which was rejected on the grounds that a failure to detonate would embolden the Japanese, the committee delivered its final recommendation. The bomb should be used against a Japanese city with military value as soon as possible, without prior specific warning of the nature of the weapon. Truman ultimately concurred with this recommendation. The final decision was not made in a vacuum but against the backdrop of an uncompromising enemy, the immense psychological pressure of the Trinity test success, and the overwhelming desire to avoid the bloodshed of a ground invasion. It was a choice between two moral horrors: the certain massive casualties of prolonged conventional war versus the unknown catastrophic consequences of introducing the nuclear weapon to warfare. Truman made the pragmatic choice, driven by the perceived imperative of his primary duty: the protection of American soldiers. The decision to use the atomic bomb immediately initiated the final, highly coordinated military operation of the Manhattan Project, the delivery of the weapon to Japan. The operation was assigned to the 509th Composite Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces, a specialized unit commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, whose sole mission was the training and execution of the atomic bombing raids. The first target chosen was Hiroshima, a large Japanese city with significant military industry, large troop concentrations, and an untouched urban center that would clearly demonstrate the bomb's destructive power. The mission to deliver the Little Boy uranium-235 gun-type bomb was set for the morning of August 6, 1945. The bomb was transported to the staging base on Tinian Island in the Pacific, where the core components were finally armed and loaded onto the specially modified B-29 bomber. The B-29 chosen for the mission was christened the Enola Gay, named after Colonel Tibbets' mother. The flight itself was a culmination of years of technical precision. The bomb, which weighed over 9,000 pounds, was a bespoke weapon that had never been tested, relying entirely on the perfect function of the gun mechanism and the accurate calculations of the Los Alamos scientists. The crew, though aware they were carrying a new type of weapon, was not fully cognizant of the sheer scale of the bomb's power, operating under strict compartmentalization protocols. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the Enola Gay dropped the Little Boy over the center of Hiroshima. The bomb fell for 43 seconds before detonating at an altitude of approximately 1,900 feet, an airburst designed to maximize the destructive force and minimize the residual fallout. The resulting energy release was equivalent to approximately 13,000 tons of TNT. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A massive, blinding flash of light was followed by a colossal shockwave and intense heat that reached millions of degrees at the hypocenter. 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed instantly or died within minutes from the blast and thermal radiation, with countless others receiving fatal radiation doses. The vast majority of the city's buildings were obliterated, flattened by the force of the blast. The cloud of smoke, fire, and dust rose quickly to form the now iconic mushroom cloud, a terrifying symbol that Colonel Tibbets and his crew watched from a safe distance, immediately realizing they had witnessed a new chapter in human history. The bombing of Hiroshima, a meticulously planned scientific and military operation, instantly achieved its intended political goal. It announced to the world, and most urgently to Japan, that a new, absolute weapon was now in the possession of the United States. It was the first definitive use of the atomic bomb in combat, transforming the theoretical physics of the Manhattan Project into the grim, irreversible reality of the atomic age. Following the catastrophic destruction of Hiroshima, the Japanese Imperial War Council debated intensely, but failed to reach a consensus on unconditional surrender. The political deadlock and the failure of the Japanese leadership to grasp the singular nature of the atomic weapon necessitated the second and final atomic strike, bringing the Manhattan Project to its brutal, defining close. The second mission was launched 3 days later, on August 9, 1945. The target was the city of Kokura, but due to heavy cloud cover and the strict military orders that the bomb must be dropped visually, the B-29 bomber boxcar diverted to its secondary target, Nagasaki, a major port city with significant industrial production. The bomb carried on this mission was the Fat Man, the more powerful plutonium-239 implosion device, whose design had been validated at the Trinity test. At 11:02 a.m. local time, the Fat Man was dropped over Nagasaki. Although more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, the rugged, hilly terrain of Nagasaki partially shielded areas of the city. Nonetheless, the resulting explosion, equivalent to about 21,000 tons of TNT, immediately killed an estimated 35,000 to 70,000 people, destroying the northern industrial sector of the city. In the span of 3 days, the United States had utilized both of its available, non-tested atomic designs, demonstrating not only the power of the new weapon but also the immediate viability of its production pipeline. The second bombing finally broke the political stalemate in Tokyo. Faced with the realization that the United States possessed not a unique single bomb but a production capability for a weapon of ultimate destruction, Emperor Hirohito intervened, stating his decision to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, conditioned only on the continued sovereignty of the imperial position. On August 15, 1945 Japan time, the emperor addressed the nation via radio, announcing Japan's surrender. World War II was officially over. The immediate aftermath was one of stunned relief in the Allied nations, coupled with a deep, unsettling fear of the power that had just been unleashed. The atomic bombings did indeed prevent the need for Operation Downfall, saving countless lives on both sides of the conflict. However, the legacy was immediate and horrific. The survivors, known as the Hibakusha, were left to deal with the immediate physical devastation, the long-term suffering from blast injuries, burns, and the mysterious deadly effects of radiation poisoning, a phenomenon barely understood at the time. The immediate medical and administrative response highlighted the catastrophic, indiscriminate nature of the atomic weapon, confirming the moral anxieties of the scientists. The Manhattan Project had achieved its military goal of ending the war, but it had done so by forever introducing the specter of total, instantaneous annihilation, casting a long, dark shadow over the hard-won peace. The Manhattan Project, spanning 6 years, costing billions of dollars, and mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people, was a monumental success of human organization and scientific genius. It achieved its objective: the creation of a weapon capable of altering the geopolitical landscape and ultimately forcing the end of the deadliest conflict in human history. Yet, the story does not end with the surrender. It begins with the chilling legacy of the atomic age that the project ushered in. The immediate legacy of the project was the revolution in military and political power. The atomic bomb fundamentally changed the nature of warfare, introducing the concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, where the use of the weapon by one side guaranteed the annihilation of both. The successful use of the bomb provided the United States with a temporary, unprecedented global supremacy, but this monopoly was short-lived, quickly shattered by the successful Soviet test in 1949, fueled by the espionage within the Manhattan Project itself. The subsequent nuclear arms race, the very outcome feared by the scientists in the Frank Report, became the defining, terrifying feature of the Cold War. The moral legacy of the project remains its most enduring and difficult chapter. The scientists who built the bomb, once hailed as heroes of the war, found themselves burdened by the weight of their creation. Many, including Oppenheimer, Fermi, and Szilard, dedicated the remainder of their careers to arms control and the promotion of peaceful nuclear technology, driven by an urgent desire to control the genie they had let out of the bottle. The profound ethical question of whether the ends justify the means, saving lives through invasion by sacrificing lives through atomic terror, remains unanswered and continues to shape discussions on morality in warfare. The images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand as permanent reminders of the absolute, unforgiving power of the fission bomb. The ultimate significance of the Manhattan Project is that it demonstrated the unlimited potential and terrifying irresponsibility of scientific progress when weaponized by a nation at total war. It was a project that required the suppression of ethical debate in favor of military expediency, and its success ensured that humanity would forever live under the shadow of the bomb, a perpetual existential threat. The scientific truth of E equals mc squared was proven with devastating finality, granting humankind the ability to destroy its civilization. The story of the Manhattan Project is thus a cautionary tale, a chronicle of unprecedented technological genius that granted humanity a godlike power, followed by a profound, agonizing struggle to govern that power with human-level responsibility. The bomb ended one war, but it simultaneously launched the world into a new eternal age of nuclear risk, demanding a perpetual vigilance that continues to define our world today. The legacy of Los Alamos is not just in the ruins of two cities, but in the shared global anxiety that remains the ultimate final product of the race to build the atomic bomb.